They expected punishment. Instead, they were given chocolate. Summer 1945. A ruined village outside Tokyo. Ash drifts through air thick with defeat. Charred timber frames lean against nothing. The smell of smoke has become permanent, woven into fabric and skin and memory itself. Children watch from behind rubble as American soldiers walk through their world. Weapons slung low, boots crunching on broken tile. One soldier stops, kneels, unwraps something brown and geometric. A Hershey bar, though the boy staring at him doesn't know that name yet. The soldier extends his hand. The boy flinches. His mother gasps, pulls him closer. But the soldier waits, patient. Smiling beneath the shadow of his helmet, the boy takes it. This is the story of the American occupation of Japan, told not through politics or generals, but through something far smaller. A bar of chocolate, a cake of soap, and the quiet rebuilding of trust between enemies. August 1945. Japan's urban centers lay in systematic ruin. Not the chaotic destruction of medieval siege, but the precise annihilation that modern industrial warfare delivers. Tokyo's casualty figures told one story: 333 B-29 superfortress bombers, 1,700 tons of incendiaries, 88,000 dead in a single night. Hiroshima and Nagasaki told another atomic fire, consuming civilization in microseconds, leaving shadows burned into stone where human beings once stood. The statistical architecture of defeat was comprehensive. 66 major cities damaged or destroyed. Industrial capacity reduced to 28% of pre-war output. Agricultural production collapsed to 71%, creating a caloric deficit that threatened 10 million lives. The average Tokyo resident subsisted on 1,400 calories daily, below the threshold required for sustained physical labor. To the average Japanese civilian, the name America existed as a constellation of terror. From the skies had come strategic bombing campaigns executed with methodical precision. B-29 seconds, flying at altitudes unreachable by Japanese fighters, dropping payloads calibrated to maximize firestorm propagation in wooden urban centers. The physics of destruction reduced to engineering tables and bombardier calculations. Then abruptly, the machinery of war ceased operation. Emperor Hirohito spoke for the first time in recorded history. His voice transmitted through radio networks to a population conditioned to hear him only through imperial silence. The dual voice, broadcast on August 15th, carried a message wrapped in classical court language. Most citizens barely understood the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Translation: unconditional surrender. The soldiers stacked their Arisaka rifles. The rising sun flag descended from administrative buildings across the archipelago. From the sea came the conquerors. But the occupation that materialized across Japanese territory operated according to protocols unprecedented in military history. Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers General Douglas MacArthur implemented occupation directives that prioritized reconstruction over retribution, institutional transformation over territorial exploitation. Instead of chains came food distribution networks. Instead of systematic violence came carefully calibrated policies of cultural respect and material assistance. The central analytical question reverberates across decades. How did tactical gestures of individual compassion, bars of chocolate, cakes of soap, acts of quotidian kindness, interface with strategic occupation policy to fundamentally reshape the psychological infrastructure of a defeated nation? What systemic mechanisms transformed enemies into allies within the span of a single generation? September 2nd, 1945, USS Missouri, Tokyo Bay. The instrument of surrender bore signatures from 9 allied nations, but the operational reality of occupation fell primarily to American military infrastructure. Within 72 hours, the 8th Army's 11th Airborne Division began landing operations at Atsugi Airfield, followed by mechanized infantry divisions deploying through Yokohama port facilities. The logistical architecture was unprecedented. 460,000 occupation personnel to be staged across the Japanese archipelago by year's end, requiring daily supply shipments exceeding 14,000 tons. The soldiers approaching Japanese shores carried tactical expectations shaped by 4 years of Pacific theater combat. Intelligence briefings emphasized threat assessment protocols, potential guerrilla resistance, civilian hostility indices calibrated from Saipan and Okinawa campaigns, where Japanese civilians had chosen mass suicide over surrender. Each rifle company maintained dispersed formation patterns optimized for urban counterinsurgency. Sidearms remained loaded, though formal rules of engagement mandated restraint absent direct provocation. What materialized instead was a population operating under different psychological parameters entirely. When the 1st Marine Divisions moved through Yokohama's ruins, they encountered silence configured as survival strategy. Streets lined with civilians maintaining postural submissions, bodies bowed at precise angles denoting hierarchical deference, eyes averted according to cultural protocols of submission before authority. Mothers clutched infants with biological urgency. Elderly citizens stood immobile, awaiting whatever fate occupation forces would administer. The architectural context amplified the human drama. Yokohama's urban infrastructure displayed destruction patterns consistent with multiple firebombing campaigns. Residential districts reduced to square kilometers of ash and twisted metal commercial zones, exhibiting the characteristic skeletal remains of reinforced concrete frames, their facades stripped away to reveal internal structural systems like anatomical cross-sections. Population density calculations suggested approximately 200,000 displaced persons operating within the greater Yokohama-Tokyo corridor, existing in improvised shelter networks among the rubble. Japan existed as a nation calibrated for retribution. Imperial propaganda had spent years constructing narratives of American barbarism, stories of systematic atrocities, tales of soldiers who took trophies from corpses, accounts of populations enslaved or exterminated. These weren't abstract fears but tactical expectations shaped by Japan's own occupation methodologies in Manchuria, Shanghai, Manila. The psychological preparation was for violence as policy, humiliation as strategy. The actual encounter operated according to different principles. A Marine corporal from 3rd Division, later interviewed for occupation documentation, described his first civilian interaction. An elderly man collapsed on a roadside, malnourished to the point of immobility. Standard procedure dictated non-interference with civilian populations during initial staging operations. But the corporal stopped, helped the man stand, offered him a K-ration tin, canned meat, crackers, processed cheese. The man stared at the food as though confronting an incomprehensible artifact, then wept. These moments repeated across hundreds of contact points. Soldiers distributing emergency rations from their own supplies. Medics treating civilian injuries despite explicit orders, limiting medical resources to military personnel. Engineers sharing water purification tablets with village populations facing waterborne disease vectors. Each interaction represented a micro-level deviation from expected occupation protocols, creating cumulative psychological effects that transcended individual gestures. The systemic implications became apparent within the first month. Supreme Commander MacArthur's headquarters documented sound-unexpected pacification rates. Projected resistance incidents per 1,000 civilian contacts was estimated at 14.3, based on Pacific Theater precedents. Actual incidents measured 0.7. The occupation was proceeding not through force projection, but through something the strategic planning apparatus had failed to model adequately: the destabilizing effect of unexpected mercy on a population conditioned for punishment. In a Yokohama side street, a soldier dropped his rifle to help a child retrieve a doll from rubble. In another district, a quartermaster sergeant distributed chocolate bars to a group of orphans outside a destroyed school. In Kamakura, an army lieutenant used his personal soap ration to help clean wounded civilians at a makeshift clinic. The occupation began not with violence, but with curiosity. And in that curiosity lay the seeds of transformation. By winter 1945, Japan confronted a caloric catastrophe operating at civilizational scale. The agricultural infrastructure had sustained systematic degradation. Wartime labor conscription removed 2.4 million farm workers from cultivation operations. Chemical fertilizer production declined to 18% of pre-war capacity due to naval blockade effects on phosphate imports, and rice yield per hectare dropped from 2,890 kilograms to 1,760 kilograms between 1941 and 1945. The mathematics of starvation became unavoidable. The Supreme Commander's nutritional assessment, compiled through October, 1,945 documented crisis parameters with clinical precision. Urban populations required minimum daily caloric intake of 2,100 calories, for basic metabolic function and light labor. Actual ration distributions averaged 1050 calories in Tokyo, 980 inches, Osaka 920 inches, Nagoya. Rice stocks measured 2.1 million metric tons against projected winter consumption requirements of 4.7 million metric tons, a deficit that would manifest as mass mortality absent external intervention. The spatial distribution of hunger followed industrial collapse patterns. Bombed urban centers faced compound deprivation, destroyed housing infrastructure plus severed food distribution networks plus decimated local production capacity. Tokyo's population density measured 1,5000 persons per square kilometer in habitable zones, yet food distribution terminals operated at 12% of pre-war throughput. The resulting queuing dynamics created daily bread lines extending 1.2 kilometers, with average wait times of 4 hours for ration allocations insufficient for survival. American soldiers moving through these tableaux confronted visceral human consequences that intelligence briefings had rendered as statistical abstractions. Malnutrition manifested in observable physiological markers, BMI measurements averaging 16.2 inches adult populations, where 18.5 represents the clinical threshold for chronic undernourishment. Edema patterns indicating protein deficiency, pediatric growth retardation, suggesting multi-generational nutritional debt. One Army medical officer documented examining a child whose physical development metrics suggested age 7, though family records indicated age 11, the somatic cost of 3 years wartime deprivation. The cognitive dissonance was profound. These soldiers had spent years conducting combat operations against an enemy framed through dehumanizing propaganda architectures. Now they witnessed that enemy reduced to biological fundamentals, hunger, exhaustion, the desperate mathematics of survival. A corporal from the 27th Infantry Division later recalled, "You train to see them as the enemy. Then you watch a mother try to nurse an infant when she's too starved to produce milk. They weren't the enemy anymore, just hungry people." The institutional response evolved through improvised humanitarian protocols that exceeded formal occupation mandates. Military government teams began supplementing official Japanese ration systems with U.S. Army field rations, despite regulations specifying such resources for military personnel exclusively. The scale grew systematically. Initial distributions measured 47 tons daily in September, expanding to 380 tons daily by December, as unit commanders authorized emergency requisitions from Pacific Theater supply depots. The symbolic inversion was complete. Strategic air forces had delivered 147,000 tons of incendiary ordnance on Japanese cities, optimizing urban firestorm propagation through calculated dispersal patterns. Now, the same logistical apparatus that had orchestrated industrial-scale destruction pivoted to food distribution operations, delivering canned meat, powdered milk, vitamin supplements, materiel designed to sustain life rather than extinguish it. Civilians encountered these supplies with responses calibrated by years of deprivation. Spam processed meat in distinctive blue tins became a term integrated into Japanese vocabulary, pronounced supamu, representing protein intake unavailable since 1943. Powdered eggs, condensed milk, K-ration crackers, each item represented nutritional density incomprehensible within the collapsed Japanese food economy. The first distributions produced scenes of desperate gratitude, elderly citizens bowing repeatedly, mothers weeping children, clutching tins with protective intensity. The occupation's early phase thus established a psychological foundation built on biological necessity. Trust emerged not from political rhetoric, but from metabolic reality. The conqueror became provider, the bomber became feeder, the destroyer became sustainer. And in that fundamental inversion, the architecture of reconciliation began its construction one meal at a time. The chemistry of cleanliness became a vector for psychological reconstruction. Soap, chemically defined as the sodium or potassium salts of fatty acids produced through saponification reactions, had functioned as a basic hygiene commodity in pre-war Japanese society, with domestic production reaching 87000 metric tons annually through 1940. By August 1945, civilian soap availability had collapsed to 4,200 metric tons across the entire archipelago, representing a 95.2% production decline attributable to fat and oil, requisitioning for military glycerin production, particularly for explosives manufacturing. The occupation forces arrived with different supply parameters entirely. Standard U.S. Army field hygiene protocols specified soap allocation at 200 grams per soldier per month, formulated to military specifications, requiring minimum 76% total fatty acid content for effective cleansing in diverse water. Hardness conditions. The logistics were substantial, supplying 4,600,000 occupation personnel, demanded 92 metric tons, monthly shipped through Pacific Theater supply chains that had recently transported 16,000 tons of ordnance daily during active combat operations. What transformed this logistical data into historical significance was the discretionary redistribution pattern that emerged. Beginning in October 1945, civil affairs teams documented systematic soap distribution to civilian populations, initially through medical necessity protocols, preventing typhoid and dysentery in refugee concentration zones, then expanding into general humanitarian distribution. By December, occupation forces were allocating approximately 23 metric tons monthly to Japanese civilian populations, representing roughly 1/4 of military soap stocks being diverted to non-military applications. For Japanese civilians operating within collapsed industrial infrastructure, soap represented more than hygiene, it functioned as a civilization marker. Wartime soap substitutes had devolved through progressive desperation, rice bran paste ash lye solutions, with caustic pH levels exceeding 12, that damaged skin tissue, or simple cold water washing that provided minimal bacterial reduction. Urban populations in bombed districts often went weeks without effective cleansing agents, creating dermatological conditions and disease vectors that occupation medical surveys documented with clinical alarm. The first distribution operations occurred outside Tokyo's Ueno district, where Army engineers had established a water purification station serving approximately 15,000 displaced civilians. A quartermaster unit allocated 840 kilograms of military soap standard white bars, each 100 grams stamped with U.S. Army designation. The civilian response confounded operational expectations. Recipients handled the bars with reverence typically reserved for precious commodities, examining texture and scent with focused attention that suggested encountering luxury goods rather than basic hygiene supplies. The sensory dimension carried particular significance. American military soap employed synthetic fragrances, chemical compounds like coumarin, and synthetic linalool that produced olfactory signatures, completely foreign to Japanese sensory frameworks, conditioned by traditional vegetable oil. Soaps. One civilian account described the scent as clean, strange, like something from another world entirely. This scent began propagating through refugee camps and urban districts, becoming an atmospheric marker of American presence and symbolically of the occupation's relatively benign character compared to anticipated brutality. The dignity implications operated at intersection points between material utility and psychological restoration. Cleanliness in Japanese cultural frameworks connected deeply to concepts of purity and social acceptability. The ability to maintain hygiene standards represented participation in civilized social order. Conversely, enforced uncleanliness signified degradation, a reduction from human status to something less, exactly the condition that defeated populations historically experienced under punitive occupation regimes. By providing soap occupation, forces were communicating something beyond hygiene protocols. They were acknowledging the civilian population's humanity, their right to dignity, their continued membership in civilized society, despite military defeat. The soap became semiotic, a physical object encoding messages about respect, about the nature of the occupation, about American intentions toward the defeated population. The systemic effects manifested through health metrics. Within 3 months, typhoid incidents declined 67% in districts with regular soap distribution compared to areas relying on indigenous substitutes. But the psychological metrics proved harder to quantify and ultimately more significant. Soap distribution generated trust accumulation that formal political pronouncements could not achieve. It transformed the occupation's texture from military imposition to humanitarian intervention, one bar at a time. The confectionery diplomacy that emerged during occupation operations represented a convergence of industrial capacity, nutritional science, and psychological warfare, inadvertently repurposed for humanitarian ends. The Hershey chocolate bar, specifically the Ration D variant, developed in 1937 for military field conditions, had been engineered to precise specifications: 4 ounces, 600 calories, formulated to withstand temperatures up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, without melting, with deliberate palatability limitations to prevent soldiers from consuming emergency rations as candy. Yet this industrial product, designed for military functionality, became the occupation's most powerful cultural ambassador. The supply architecture was substantial. U.S. military procurement had contracted for 380 million Ration D bars during wartime production cycles, with additional contracts for the improved tropical bar variant, optimized for Pacific theater conditions. By late 1945, Pacific supply depots contained approximately 24 million pounds of chocolate reserves, surplus inventory from cancelled invasion operations, now staged across occupation logistics networks in Japan. The question became, what to do with this materiel in an environment where candy represented more strategic value than weapons. For Japanese civilian populations, particularly children, chocolate existed as a conceptual abstraction rather than experiential reality. Domestic sugar production had been militarized by 1943, with refined sugar allocated exclusively to military applications and industrial processes. Cocoa imports, entirely dependent on Southeast Asian supply chains disrupted by Allied naval operations, had ceased by 1942. Children born after 1940 had never tasted chocolate. Those older retained only fragmentary sensory memories of pre-war confectionery traditions, increasingly distant from lived experience. The distribution patterns that emerged operated through informal networks that supplemented official occupation protocols. Individual soldiers began carrying chocolate bars as impromptu goodwill gestures, creating contact moments that strategic planners had never formally designed, but which proved tactically invaluable. A GI from the 1st Cavalry Division would kneel to offer a Hershey bar to a child scavenging through rubble. The child's initial hesitation, conditioned by months of propaganda depicting Americans as barbaric destroyers, would dissolve upon tasting sweetness absent from their sensory repertoire for years. The neurochemistry was straightforward. Chocolate contains theobromine and trace caffeine, producing mild euphoric effects through dopamine pathway activation, while sugar content triggers immediate reward responses in glucose-deprived metabolisms. For children subsisting on 800 to 1,000 calories daily, a 4-ounce chocolate bar represented 60% of daily caloric intake, delivered in a format that produced pleasure rather than mere sustenance. The psychological impact transcended nutritional metrics. Documentation from Civil Information and Education Section surveys, conducted through early 1946, captured civilian testimony that revealed the symbolic potency. One mother described her son's reaction. He smiled for the first time since the B-29 seconds came. In that moment, I understood the war might truly be over. Another account from a Tokyo schoolteacher. When the American soldier gave my students chocolate, something broke inside me. I had taught them to hate these men. But watching them share sweetness with our children, I couldn't reconcile propaganda with reality. The systemic implications operated at multiple analytical levels. Tactically, chocolate distribution generated immediate goodwill that facilitated occupation operations, reducing civilian resistance potential, while creating positive association networks between American military presence and material benefit. Strategically, it initiated cultural transformation by demonstrating that American power manifested not solely through destructive capability, but through surplus abundance, an industrial capacity so vast it could casually distribute luxury goods in a context of general scarcity. The occupation's chocolate distribution represented approximately 2,800 metric tons delivered to civilian populations between September 1945 and December 1946, roughly 14 million individual bars. Each bar functioned as a micro-diplomatic intervention, reconfiguring enemy-victor dynamics through sensory experience. In the arithmetic of reconciliation, sweetness proved more persuasive than speeches, more effective than formal treaties. Chocolate became the taste of peace, one bite at a time. The occupation's strategic architecture represented a deliberate departure from historical precedent in military governance of defeated territories. Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers headquarters, established at the Dai-ichi Insurance Building in Tokyo, operated as a parallel governmental structure, implementing directives that reflected comprehensive institutional redesign, rather than punitive administration. General Douglas MacArthur's strategic framework synthesized political reconstruction, economic stabilization, and psychological transformation through what occupation planners termed democratization through demonstration, a methodology, prioritizing behavioral modeling over coercive enforcement. The doctrinal foundation emerged from Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive 1380/15, issued the 29th of August 1945, which specified occupation objectives with unusual precision: demilitarization of Japanese society, establishment of democratic political institutions, economic reconstruction oriented toward peaceful development, and cultural transformation through education reform. But the operational innovation occurred in implementation methodology. Rather than governing through military tribunals and emergency decrees, the standard occupation template exemplified by Allied governance in defeated Germany. MacArthur's administration emphasized institutional continuity, utilizing existing Japanese bureaucratic infrastructure while redirecting its operational parameters toward democratic frameworks. The scale of administrative transformation was comprehensive. SCAP headquarters deployed 5,423 civilian and military personnel across 32 specialized sections, managing everything from economic policy to educational curriculum reform. The government section oversaw constitutional revision, producing a document that transformed Japan from imperial monarchy to parliamentary democracy within 6 months, a timeline that compressed evolutionary political development typically requiring decades into systematic legislative engineering. The Civil Information and Education section restructured the entire educational apparatus, removing militaristic content from 11876 textbook editions, while training 341000 teachers in democratic pedagogic methods. But the occupation's most sophisticated innovation operated at the individual behavioral level, where military personnel functioned as democratic ambassadors through daily conduct. SCAP General Order No. 1, issued to all occupation forces, established protocols unprecedented in military governance. You will treat Japanese officials and civilians with courtesy and respect appropriate to representatives of a democratic nation. Physical violence, intimidation, or exploitation of civilian populations is strictly prohibited and will be prosecuted under military justice codes. The penalties were substantial. Courts-martial documentation reveals 1,438 cases prosecuted through 1,946, with conviction rates of 76%, and sentences, including dishonorable discharge and imprisonment. The strategic calculation was precise. Occupation forces would demonstrate democratic values through behavioral consistency rather than rhetorical proclamation. A soldier distributing food demonstrated equality principles more effectively than political speeches. A military policeman adjudicating disputes fairly illustrated rule of law better than constitutional documents. The occupation became a lived civics lesson, with 460000 service personnel functioning as unwitting pedagogical instruments in a massive societal re-education program. The comparative framework highlighted the strategy's distinctiveness. Japanese military occupation of Manchuria, the Philippines, and Southeast Asian territories had operated through systematic exploitation, resource extraction, averaging 47% of colonial GDP, forced labor conscription, exceeding 2.1 million persons, and administrative brutality that generated resistance movements requiring 6,30000 troops for suppression operations. The Soviet occupation of Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands proceeded through population expulsion and industrial dismantlement, removing 94% of Japanese civilians and transferring 3,200 industrial facilities to Soviet territory. The American occupation model inverted these parameters entirely. Economic assistance measured $2.1 billion between 1945 to 1951, approximately $32 billion in inflation-adjusted contemporary values directed toward reconstruction rather than extraction. Military conduct protocols emphasized restraint with documented violence incidents measuring 0.7 per 1,000 military-civilian contacts compared to 14.3 per 10 inches previous Pacific Theater. Occupation zones. The message encoded in daily interactions was unambiguous. Democratic nations exercise power through institutional legitimacy rather than coercive force. The occupation thus functioned as applied political theory, testing whether democracy could be cultivated through institutional transplantation and behavioral modeling. The chocolate and soap distributions represented tactical implementations of this strategic vision, small gestures aggregating into systemic transformation, one interaction at a time. The psychological architecture of defeated populations operates according to predictable frameworks calibrated by historical precedent. Japanese civilian expectations regarding occupation conduct derived from empirical observation of their own military's administrative methodologies across occupied territories, combined with propaganda narratives designed to sustain wartime morale through demonization of enemy forces. The resulting cognitive model anticipated systematic retribution at civilizational scale. The comparative baseline was established through Japan's own occupation operations. In Nanjing, December 1937, Japanese military forces conducted a 6-week campaign, producing approximately 2,000 civilian casualties through systematic execution, sexual violence, and property destruction. What? Tribunal documentation, later classified as crimes against humanity, operating through institutionalized brutality. In Manila, February 1945, retreating Japanese forces implemented scorched earth protocols, resulting in 1,000 civilian deaths, through deliberate massacre operations designed to deny enemy forces a viable urban center. In Manchuria, Unit 731 conducted biological warfare experiments on approximately 1,000 human subjects, operating through medical protocols that reduced human beings to experimental data points. Japanese civilians possessed intimate knowledge of these operational methodologies through military personnel testimony, official propaganda, celebrating imperial conquest, and cultural narratives framing such conduct as necessary expressions of martial superiority. The logical inference was straightforward. Victorious American forces would implement comparable protocols, perhaps enhanced by technological capabilities that had produced atomic annihilation at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Civilian survival strategies calibrated accordingly, concealing valuables, hiding daughters, preparing for violence as systemic policy rather than individual aberration. The actual occupation parameters generated profound cognitive dissonance through systematic deviation from anticipated patterns. Sexual violence incidents, the standard metric for occupation force discipline, measured 0.09 per 1,000 military personnel monthly during the initial occupation phase compared to estimated rates of 3.7 per 1,000 during Japanese occupation operations in Southeast Asia. Property requisitioning followed formal protocols with compensation mechanisms rather than arbitrary confiscation. Food distributions increased rather than decreased civilian nutritional access. The empirical reality contradicted every predictive model derived from historical precedent. The psychological processing of this dissonance produced response patterns documented through civil censorship detachment, monitoring of 3.7 million pieces of civilian correspondence during 1945 to 1946. A Kyoto resident wrote, "We expected demons but encountered men who share their rations with our children. I cannot reconcile what we were told with what I witnessed daily." A Tokyo merchant recorded, "The Americans treat us with courtesy we did not extend to conquered peoples. This produces shame more profound than defeat itself." The educational infrastructure confronted particular crisis as empirical observation undermined pedagogical foundations. Teachers who had spent years inculcating hatred toward American barbarism now observed those same Americans demonstrating discipline, restraint, and systematic kindness. The cognitive framework collapsed under accumulated counter-evidence. A school teacher in Yokohama documented the transformation I taught my students, that Americans were subhuman creatures motivated by primitive violence. Then, an American soldier stopped his truck to help repair our school's water pump, working through his lunch period while sharing chocolate with the children. Every lesson I taught became a lie before my eyes. The systemic implications operated at civilizational psychology levels. Trust reconstruction between former enemies typically requires generational timescales, approximately 40 to 60 years, according to comparative reconciliation studies, examining French-German relations post-1871 or Russo-Polish dynamics post-1945. The American occupation of Japan compressed this timeline through behavioral consistency that generated trust accumulation at unprecedented rates. Public opinion surveys conducted by Civil Information and Education Section documented favorable attitudes toward occupation forces, increasing from 23% in September 1945 to 67% by March 1946. A psychological transformation occurring at velocity that historical models suggested should be impossible. The occupation became an education operating bidirectionally. Japanese civilians learned that mercy could accompany strength, that victors need not brutalize the defeated, that democratic societies operate through institutional legitimacy rather than coercive terror. American forces learned that humanity persists beneath enemy designations, that reconciliation represents strategic victory superior to punitive occupation, that former adversaries can become partners through systematic demonstration of respect. The Reconstruction architecture that emerged between 1946 and 1952 represented systematic socio-economic engineering at civilizational scale, transforming a militarized imperial state into a pacifist industrial democracy. Through coordinated institutional intervention across multiple societal domains, the aggregate investment flows measured $1 billion in nominal terms, approximately $32 billion, adjusted for contemporary purchasing power, channeled through Economic Stabilization Board, mechanisms that prioritized infrastructure restoration, industrial modernization, and human capital development over punitive reparations extraction. The infrastructural restoration proceeded through priority allocation systems calibrated to maximize cascading economic effects. Transportation networks received 38% of initial reconstruction capital, focusing on the Tokaido corridor, linking Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe, the industrial arterial system containing 67% of Japanese manufacturing capacity. Railway restoration targeted 8,470 kilometers of track, requiring repair with particular emphasis on gauge standardization and electrification upgrades that would increase freight throughput from 94 million ton-kilometers in 1945 to 387 million ton-kilometers by 1950. Port facilities in Yokohama, Kobe, and Osaka received dredging operations, crane installations, and warehouse construction that expanded aggregate handling capacity from 2.1 million metric tons annually in 1945 to 7 million metric tons by 1951. The educational transformation operated through comprehensive curriculum revision, affecting 11.2 million students across 34000 primary and secondary institutions. The Education Mission Report, compiled by 27 American educators during March 1946, recommended structural reforms that eliminated militaristic content, introduced democratic civic education, extended compulsory schooling from 6 to 9 years, and implemented co-educational instruction, transforming pedagogical frameworks from authoritarian indoctrination to critical thinking development. Teacher retraining programs processed 341,000 educators through intensive democratic pedagogy courses, averaging 120 instructional hours, creating a teaching corps capable of socializing an entire generation into democratic participation frameworks. The constitutional architecture represented the most ambitious institutional transplantation in modern governance history. The government section, operating under direction of Brigadier General Courtney Whitney, drafted a comprehensive constitutional document between February 4 to 1946, a 7-day intensive process. producing 5000 words, establishing parliamentary democracy, guaranteeing civil liberties, implementing women's suffrage, and embedding Article 9's War Renunciation Clause. The document's operational implementation required 102 enabling statutes enacted between 1947 to 1949, restructuring everything from agricultural land ownership patterns to corporate governance frameworks, local administrative autonomy. The economic stabilization mechanisms synthesized Keynesian demand management with targeted industrial policy, creating hybrid frameworks that would later inform development economics across Asia. The Dodge Plan, implemented in 1949 under Detroit banker Joseph Dodge, imposed fiscal austerity that reduced inflation from 166% annually in 1946 to 3.2% by 1951, while maintaining strategic subsidies for priority sectors, steel production, electric power generation, and coal mining. The foreign exchange allocation system channeled scarce dollar reserves toward importing technology and raw materials rather than consumer goods, prioritizing industrial reconstruction over immediate consumption satisfaction. The aggregate transformation metrics documented civilizational scale change compressed into single-decade timeframes. Industrial production recovered to pre-war levels by 195–194% of 1,935 to 37 baseline output, despite losing colonial territories that had provided 47% of empire-wide industrial capacity. Real GDP per capita increased from $1.346 inches, 1,946, to $2.188 inches, 1,952–199, $0 international dollars, representing 62% growth during Reconstruction phase. Literacy rates approached 98% by 1950, creating human capital foundations for subsequent technological development. The occupation's strategic legacy manifested in institutional architectures persisting decades beyond formal termination in April 1952. The constitutional framework remained unrevised through 2025. The educational structures continued shaping socialization patterns. The economic policy templates informed East Asian development models from South Korea to Taiwan to Singapore. What began with chocolate and soap, symbolic gestures encoded with messages about dignity and respect, culminated in comprehensive societal transformation that repositioned Japan from defeated enemy to democratic ally within 7 years of atomic bombardment. The strategic calculus of mercy operates outside conventional military doctrine, yet its operational effects often exceed kinetic force projection in achieving durable political outcomes. The American occupation of Japan represented a natural experiment in reconciliation mechanics, testing whether systematic compassion could function as a viable strategic instrument rather than merely an ethical preference. The empirical results suggested affirmative conclusions with profound implications for post-conflict reconstruction theory. The comparative analytical framework illuminates the occupation's distinctiveness through systematic contrast with alternative governance models implemented during the same historical period. Soviet occupation of Eastern European territories proceeded through asset extraction. 1,4,0,0 industrial facilities dismantled and transferred to Soviet territory from East Germany alone, representing approximately $14 billion in capital expropriation. French administration of occupied Saarland implemented resource extraction protocols, generating 48 million tons of coal, requisitioned between 1,945 to 1,950, without compensation mechanisms. British occupation zones in Germany maintained minimal sustenance, caloric allocations of 1050 calories daily through 1,946, producing mortality rates of 4.7 per 1,000 population monthly among civilian populations. The American occupation model in Japan inverted these parameters through net resource transfers flowing toward rather than away from occupied territory. The aggregate aid flows measured $2.1 billion nominal, $32 billion adjusted, but the strategic innovation operated at operational level. How resources were distributed and what psychological frameworks accompanied. Material assistance. Every chocolate bar carried implicit messaging: you remain human beings worthy of dignity, despite defeat. Every cake of soap communicated cleanliness and self-respect are rights, not privileges, contingent on victor discretion. Every act of restraint demonstrated power can be exercised through institutional legitimacy rather than coercive violence. The neuropsychological mechanisms underlying trust reconstruction operated through accumulated micro-interactions that overrode propaganda conditioning through direct experiential contradiction. Cognitive psychology research suggests trust formation requires consistent behavioral patterns, demonstrating reliability. Predicted actions match actual conduct. Benevolence actions prioritize recipient welfare and competence. Promised outcomes are successfully delivered. The occupation forces demonstrated all three dimensions simultaneously across hundreds of thousands of civilian contact points daily, a trust generation engine operating at unprecedented scale and velocity. The long-duration strategic payoffs validated the Mercy as strategy framework through measurable geopolitical outcomes. Japan transitioned from defeated enemy to treaty ally. Within 7 years, the San Francisco Peace Treaty, signed the 8th of September 1951, restored sovereignty while establishing security partnership frameworks. By 1960, the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty formalized military cooperation, positioning Japan as the cornerstone of American Pacific strategy. The economic partnership generated bilateral trade flows exceeding $310 billion annually by 2020, with Japan functioning as the fourth largest U.S. trading partner and a primary investor in American infrastructure. $679 billion in direct investment stock as of 2023. The civilizational implications transcended bilateral relations, establishing precedent frameworks for post-conflict reconstruction that influenced subsequent operations across multiple theaters. The Marshall Plan in Europe, initiated June 1947, adopted similar material assistance strategies calibrated toward reconstruction rather than punishment. The occupation of West Germany synthesized lessons from Japan regarding institutional transformation through democratic demonstration rather than coercive imposition. The broader architecture of American post-World War II strategy: containment through alliance-building, economic integration as security mechanism. Democratic promotion through positive incentive structures reflected strategic insights validated through the Japanese occupation's success metrics. The occupation's philosophical substrate rested on a fundamental proposition that human societies possess remarkable plasticity in political orientation when provided appropriate institutional frameworks, material security, and dignified treatment. The chocolate and soap distributions represented tactical implementations of this strategic philosophy. Small gestures aggregating into civilizational transformation through systematic demonstration that former enemies could become partners, that defeat need not mean dehumanization, that reconciliation serves victor interests better than perpetual enmity. In the final analysis, mercy functioned not as weakness, but as sophisticated strategic instrument, generating durable political outcomes that purely coercive occupation could never achieve. The occupation of Japan proved that compassion, properly calibrated and systematically implemented, represents the most effective foundation for lasting peace. Historical memory operates through selective retention mechanisms, privileging dramatic combat narratives over the administrative complexity of post-conflict reconstruction. The Battle of Okinawa generates documentary focus: 82 days, 49151. American casualties 11,7000 Japanese military deaths, and approximately 15,000 civilian casualties, compressed into 463 square miles of contested terrain. Yet the 7-year occupation that transformed enemies into allies receives comparatively minimal analytical attention, despite producing geopolitical outcomes that reshaped Asian power dynamics for subsequent decades. The occupation's strategic architecture revealed fundamental insights about political transformation mechanics. Institutional change requires material foundation. Populations facing caloric deficits cannot engage democratic participation frameworks effectively. Trust reconstruction operates through behavioral consistency rather than rhetorical proclamation. Each act of restraint, each gesture of respect, accumulated into systemic legitimacy, that formal treaties alone could never establish. Reconciliation emerges not from imposed settlements, but from daily interactions that demonstrate former adversaries possess shared humanity beneath ideological differences. The chocolate and soap distributions functioned as micro-diplomatic interventions, encoding macro-strategic messages that dignity transcends defeat, that compassion represents sophisticated statecraft rather than naive sentimentality, that mercy properly calibrated generates durable peace more effectively than punitive occupation. In those small gestures lay the foundation for alliance structures, persisting 8 decades beyond surrender, validating compassion as strategic instrument rather than moral luxury. The soldiers who landed as conquerors departed as architects of reconciliation. In the ruins of Tokyo, amid persistent hunger and ash-laden air, they offered more than emergency rations and hygiene supplies. They demonstrated that civilizational transformation operates through accumulated small gestures rather than grand proclamations alone. War configures human beings as instruments of destruction, calibrating psychological frameworks toward violence as operational necessity. But the aftermath demands different capacities, the ability to recognize humanity beneath enemy designations to extend dignity, when vengeance would be simpler to construct peace through patient demonstration rather than coercive imposition. Japan's transformation from fascist empire to democratic ally within a single generation represents one of history's most comprehensive reconciliation achievements. It began not with constitutional documents or economic treaties, but with chocolate bars and soap cakes, small objects carrying enormous symbolic weight, encoding messages about respect and possibility that transcended the machinery of war. Kindness properly calibrated and systematically implemented changes history more profoundly than force alone ever could.